Good afternoon. In my last talk with you, I gave you a brief plot summary of Book 1 of Gulliver's Travels. In today's talk, we'll be trying to discuss various critical aspects of Book 1, A Voyage to Lilliput. In Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the hero, Lemuel Gulliver, undertakes a series of voyages across the globe, as we know, to arrive by accident in lands completely unknown to Europeans, where cultural clashes are generally the norm, not least between the hero, Gulliver, and the native inhabitants, with human nature seemingly highly resistant to the virtues of multiculturalism, as it were, and unable to overcome cultural differences. The big Indians and the little Indians in Lilliput, as we have known in the last talk, for example, are shown as embroiled in a series of wars because of a very minor difference in their eating habits, namely, which side of the egg to break before it is taken. Gulliver himself is treated with deep suspicion by Lilliputians on their first encounter and proves to be quite a powerful disruptive force within the Lilliputian society, containing various opposed factions. Someone who, in a quite literal sense, cannot fit into the existing system. Later on, we will see that the Yahoos are about as far removed from the multicultural ideal as one could be, despite the model of sober and rational conduct provided by the ruling class in Hoyohin land. Yahooism, in a later book we will know, represents the dark side of human nature that gives birth to unthinking prejudice against almost all others and is a searing indictment of humanity by an author with a notoriously low opinion of his species. There's a famous quote that critics often refer to while qualifying Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, and that is what he says, but principally I hate and detest that animal called man. Now, Swift very successfully portrays the barriers that exist to multiculturalism in what a critic Francis de Louis once called his anatomy of misunderstanding, and many contemporary commentators are in agreement with Swift's essentially pessimistic view of human nature, which sees cultural difference as a divisive rather than as a unifying force in the world. Whether we are really as self interested and culturally divided or chauvinistic as Swift seems to believe we are, is a point that is definitely debatable and worth pondering. At the very least, the amount of conflict that currently exists between nations and cultures globally, and conflicts which show very little sign of dissipating or disappearing, provides food for thought as to the validity of Swift's negative assessment of the ability of the human race to live together peacefully as a species without taking into consideration superficial differences in cultural norms such as language, religion, etc. The inherent suspicion of the other, which gives the impression of being very hardwired into the human character, is an automatic capacity and a recipe for disagreement among most of us. Gulliver, we see, is a trained surgeon whose wanderlust takes him to sign on to several long voyages as the ship's surgeon, sometimes only a few months after returning from the last. Invariably, the voyages are danger ridden. Curiously, about the world, we may say that some form of an inherent curiosity about the world around him is what continues to motivate Gulliver towards newer and newer travels. And what he finds in his travels does little to dispose him towards the rest of the humankind, because each journey involves him being cast away on his own in a strange land, inhabited by even stranger races and species, conforming to none of the known characteristics of humanity. For example, in Book 1, A Voyage to Gulliver, he sees smaller than life sized beings. In Book 2, he sees larger than life sized beings, maybe beings distorted in feature. And then to capital, we have horses of all species or living beings endowed with speech and rationality. Each journey that Swift takes tests Gulliver's uh, abilities quite severely. In effect, he is given a crash course, as it were, in cultural difference. It is a course from which he emerges almost totally alienated from the rest of the human race, considering each member of it a mere lump of deformity, puffed up by an entirely unjustifiable pride, either in language or in mannerisms or in customs or in race or in religion or in other superficial socio-cultural parameters. Lilliput and Brobdingnag, the places where Gulliver goes in the first and the second book, are essentially posited to us in the form of a colonizing oppressor and an oppressed dichotomy, because of the power imbalance that arises between Gulliver and the inhabitants in each case. This gives him the opportunity to experience multiculturalism from two very different and contrasting perspectives. In Lilliput, for example, Gulliver swamps the culture by virtue of his size. He is the size that he is as a normal human being. The Lilliputians are around 6 inches, as we say. And that becomes a deciding factor which the local inhabitants cannot ignore. Gulliver's power of action is so superior to the Lilliputians as to render them a threat to their entire existence and culture. As Gulliver is duly informed, and I quote from the novel, where this is put into a very stark light by Swift himself. He says, "It is certain that 100 mortals of your bulk would in a short time destroy all the fruits and cattle of his Majesty's dominions." Unquote. Quite simply, Gulliver looms over everything, the great man mountain, as it were, as is dubbed, who requires a daily provision of food and drink equal to that consumed by as many as 1,728 Lilliputians. That's quite a large number in Lilliputian standards. The Lilliputians' attempts to keep him subdued prove futile, and they are thrown back on trusting to his goodwill, which luckily for them, Gulliver does feel towards them. We have another critic named Kathleen Williams who observed that it is in Lilliput that, of all books in the novel, that Gulliver is at his perhaps most influential and attractive as a character. He agrees to be bound by a contract as to his future behavior, but the Lilliputians would be hard pressed to enforce this if Gulliver chose to breach any of its clauses because of his obvious size. Lilliputians fairly had little to do with punishing Gulliver if he went back on the agreement. The inability of nations to live in harmony with one another is revealed startlingly in the long-running conflict between Lilliput and its neighboring island empire, Blefuscu. It is the disagreement between the big Indians and the little Indians, as we have learned, over which end of an egg to break before eating it. And this obviously is quite superficial and a flimsy topic to go to war on, but nevertheless, that is how we see that both these two are actually going into war. When the monarchy throws its authority behind the little Indian cause, after one of the royal family accidentally cuts his finger while breaking the big end, as custom has dictated, the result is a full-scale civil war. The Blefuscudian Empire is quick to take advantage by giving its support to the traditional Burgundians who are granted exile within their kingdom from where to continue opposition. The absurdity of the entire struggle is evident when considering their holy book's verdict on egg making, and the holy book's verdict clearly says that all true believers should break their eggs at the convenient end. Unquote. In other words, the holy book says it's entirely up to the individual and his or her mm, feeling of easiness or convenience to choose which side of the egg to break. The interpretation of this passage by Del Russell, a leading figure in the Lilliputian government, seems eminently sensible because he says, which is the convenient end seems, in my humble opinion, to be left to every man's conscience, or at least in the power of the chief magistrate to determine. Unquote. Yet, for the parties in question, such a compromise is unthinkable because they have, as you see in the novel, they have gone very far into war, into envy, and each is driven by a desire to prevail over the other, no matter how much bloodshed is proposed. Even Gulliver cannot avoid becoming caught up in this conflict, though he tried to be neutral in a sense. And while he's favoring the Lilliputian court, the court contrives to capture a large part of Blefuscu's fleet by shackling the ships together and pulling them ashore, much to the king's pleasure. As well as this external threat to Lilliputian culture, there are in the novel significant intestine disquiets, as it is termed by Swift, to record. Lilliputian politics is blighted essentially by a struggle between its two main parties. Those who advocate, for example, the wedding of high and low hills respectively, another flimsy and ludicrous consideration. So essentially, the differences of opinion between Lilliput are essentially differences which are not worth human consideration in terms of divisiveness. So seriously is this issue of high and low hill Indians is taken that supporters of each side will neither eat nor drink nor talk with each other. This is what Swift says. Swift deliberately makes the controversy quite ridiculous, but it is not so more ridiculous than the religious divisions of his own day, as he is only too well aware. And just in case we are moved to feel at all superior intellectually to the level of the Lilliputians and their flimsy disputes, many of our contemporary religious disputes too appear to be as flimsy as them. So, seen from a future perspective, the current disputes, for example, in Anglican and Catholic churches on various issues, may appear just as ridiculous to people who feel that these are disputes which are not worth disputing over, as if sexual orientation was the prime decider as to how close a person can go to God, either by being pro Catholic or being anti Catholic. So, essentially, what Book 1 wishes to convey to us is that it is the ability of human beings to keep manufacturing, as it were, such divisions that makes our social existence so unstable, and that is what acts as a very, very powerful deterrent against multiculturalism, and that is what still continues by some token as one of the chief reasons why we are no longer together as a human species, particularly togetherness implying togetherness in politics, in religion, in a universal concern of humanity. One would have to say this talent is no less evident in the 21st century as well, the talent of Swift. If anything symbolizes the extent of the cultural difference between Gulliver and the Lilliputians, it is, for example, the ludicrous episode of the royal palace fire. Gulliver feels he needs to save lives immediately, and and he feels that he has performed a great service to his nation by putting the fire out. But his hosts, after having survived from the intervention of Gulliver, is appalled at his method, which was to urinate copiously on the building from above and dousing the flames. Since it is forbidden to urinate anywhere within the palace grounds, Gulliver is automatically and technically guilty of treason, and although the emperor promises to obtain a pardon for him, the empress is so angry and incensed that she vows never to enter the buildings again and swears revenge for the outrage to her royal dignity. Gulliver cannot really understand in Book 1 how much this coarseness, as it were, of responding to an existential emergency has offended his hosts, nor does he put himself in their position to wonder what it would feel like to have one's surroundings similar to this, drowned in urine cascading from a great height. But however, he is horrified nevertheless when the situation is reversed in broad daylight, where the maids of honor treat him as if he are no more than a pet whose presence can be discarded. For example, we have a quotation in Book 2 which is too elaborately eloquent of the reverse position that Gulliver faces in Book 2 compared to Book 1, and the quotation reads like this: "Neither did they at all scruple, while I was by, to discharge what they had drunk, to the quantity of at least 2 hogsheads in a vessel that held above 3 tons." Unquote. Eventually, the palace episode returns to haunt Gulliver. He is privately warned that he is about to be charged with treason for breaking the law against urination, and he finds it expedient to flee the country for Blefuscu to prevent the officially prescribed punishment of blinding being carried out on him. It is court politics, essentially, and the differences between politicians or courtiers or lobbies, as we may call it today, that leads to Gulliver's fall from grace in the eyes of the emperor of Lilliput, and political intrigues are the only considerations which soured his stay in Lilliput, because he says very powerful lines: "I had hitherto to all my life a stranger to courts, for which I was unqualified by the meanness of my condition. I had indeed heard and read enough of the dispositions of great princes and ministers, but never expected to have found such terrible effects on them in so remote a country, governed, as I thought, by very different maxims from those in Europe." Unquote. So Swift clearly has early evidence of court intrigue after his success in putting so much of the Blefuscudian fleet out of service. This exploit merely spurs or inspires the king on to be even more asking or demanding for the damage that is to be exacted on Blefuscu, and the king or the emperor wants that Blefuscu can be brought under control through total destruction of its fleet. Gulliver's refusal to comply with the king's wishes, because Gulliver always wanted, unlike the king, that the Blefuscudians could be brought on the table of discussion and some form of a peace be instituted between these two nations. But Gulliver says unmeasurable ambition. These are the exact words that he uses to characterize Lilliputian emperor's ill will against the Blefuscudians. From then onwards, that is from the refusal of Gulliver to actually go whole hog and destroying the Blefuscudians, Gulliver is seen as a marked man in Lilliput, some form of a target, a focus of an ill will, who has to be extremely careful whom he trusts or confides in. The mean-spiritedness of the courts is a recurrent theme in Gulliver's travels, and when the emperor of Blefuscu also tries to press him into service, Gulliver declares himself, and I quote, "resolved never more to put any confidence in princes or ministers where I could possibly avoid it. Unquote. Instead, he takes the opportunity offered by the discovery of a small boat washed up on the island shore to make arrangements for his departure from Blefuscu. What he has learned from his stay in Lilliput is that court life promotes scheming and the development of factions which are constantly at warheads with one another, if not overtly but covertly, and always trying to outdo the other before the eyes of the king. And that these factions are essentially the seeds of political divisions and civil discord, which is extremely powerful in human affairs. Swift agrees because his time says it that politicians are usually disposed to harbor unmeasurable ambitions in their breast and to treat such as Gulliver mere resources to be exploited for their own sectarian interests. And this is very, very severely put into focus in Book 1, A Voyage to Lilliput, where as the book progresses, we find that Gulliver is considered only as some form of an investment in terms of the enormous amount of resources that are required to be put into Gulliver by the Lilliputians to enable him to survive. This investment is sought to be returned with a profit by using Gulliver to destroy the Blefusculians. So essentially what Book 1 of the Gulliver's Travels tell us are two issues. First, in terms of contemporary relevance, the difficulty that Gulliver faces while adjusting himself to the totally different culture of the Lilliputians is nothing but some form of a social mirror for our contemporary existence. And the second issue is a negative connotation or a negative implication of Gulliver towards politics, be it of the courtly type or be it even politics between two emperors or two kings. Because at both levels we see in Book 1 of Gulliver's Travels, in both cases, these politics end up involving men in fights for issues which are ultimately inconsequential and even suicidal to the species as a whole. So this roughly is the critical significance of the contemporary implication of the Book 1 of Gulliver's Travels, A Voyage to Lilliput. And this is perhaps the reason why this work is still studied in our curriculum today. Thank you.